So yes, thank you. That's a reminder. So do you see my screen now?
Yes.
Okay.
The meeting is being recorded. Thank you.
That's a reminder that we're recording the meeting, and we'll post it afterwards, as we always have. So we hold these meetings quarterly, and at this point, we're also holding in the intervening months on the same fourth Thursday of the month. We're still holding office hours at the same time. So just want to remind everyone that we're continuing to do that. So the agenda for today, I'm going to start off and give you some general updates. Then Diane Baxter, the director of our federal sites program, will talk about the anticipated funding from the federal infrastructure bill and how we're preparing to be ready for that. I'll give some updates about the PFAS work we're doing. Michelle Craddock, our NRD coordinator, will do some restoration highlights from the last year. And then Paul will follow up the December soil capacity discussion that we had, the listening session, just to summarize what we heard and talk about next steps on that. Okay. So the first question, which I'm sure is on, I know it's on my mind and yours as well, is where we are with the MCP and finalizing the amendments. I had really hoped that today's meeting would be one where we could, go over a summary of the final amendments and talk about next steps in terms of implementation with training and everything else that's going to be associated with that. But we are still not there yet. It is, just to reassure you, it's still an active process. It's not as if it's kind of stalled somewhere. It's still under active review. And the hope is that at our next meeting, I'll be able to do that kind of summary. Oh, the other thing I should mention, why am I hosting this meeting rather than Paul? I think since the last time we met, you're probably aware that Paul and I have both taken on interim positions. Stephanie Cooper, who was our deputy commissioner for policy and planning, was tasked to be the interim commissioner for the Department of Conservation and Recreation. And as a result of that, Paul was asked to fill Stephanie's role as DEP's deputy commissioner, and overseeing, all of the programs. And in turn, I am stepping in on an interim basis as acting assistant commissioner for waste site cleanup. So as far as we know, we're still in this status and continuing to do those roles. The good news for me is that I'm still in this position reporting to Paul, so I have all his support when I need it. As you see, he even showed up to today's meeting and is agreeing to cover the listening session from last month. Also, I've invited him to jump in on anything that I, may not get quite right, or he may know more about during today's meeting. In terms of the budget, our MassDEP's budget is looking good this year. We're not really anticipating any reductions. I think the big focus is on preparing for federal funding that we're expecting to flow through the state and into MassDEP as well. Hybrid work schedule, MassDEP staff have officially started hybrid work. Many staff have been going into the office the last couple of years during the pandemic, including emergency response Some of the regional office staff have preferred to be there, but starting in November, we began a transition to everyone coming into the office at least one day a week. And as of January 1st, that is the mode we're in right now. The other news with respect to the offices is that MassDEP will be opening its lobbies next week. I guess that's Monday, from 8:45 to 5. And that will be to allow people to come into the office, drop off packages and that sort of thing. There's still no news yet on reopening the office for public meetings and having publics coming into other spaces in our office. But as that develops, we'll let you know about that. With respect to the Boston office, one big piece of news, I think, since we last met, is the plan for our move to 100 Cambridge Street, where EEA's offices are located, has been pushed back. We were originally thinking we would be there in April, and it's now looking like October, which, for me is frankly good news, because we're having to do a lot in terms of preparing for that move, in terms of reducing our physical files and scanning those materials and that sort of thing. So the additional time will be welcome, at least on that front, to get ready for that move.
So the public access to the lobby, that's still at 1 Winter Street?
That will apply to 1 Winter Street as well as all of the regional offices. And so that will be Monday through Friday, regular business hours. So next, I wanted to highlight some of the staffing changes and all the work we're doing around hiring. As you may also be experiencing, hiring is really something we're spending a lot of time on, particularly at MassDEP, as you know, with our workforce, many of whom are retirement age. We've had a lot of retirements over the last year. We've been busy trying to keep pace with all of that, and as well as staff up and think strategically about how we want the Bureau staffed. So we've been doing a lot of work in the Boston office as well as the regional offices in bringing in new staff, also staff changing into different roles. And I just, in general, I would like to, encourage people who may be interested in working for the department to keep their eye out for the postings. There are many of them coming out right now. And I will try to highlight a few of them that we have with respect to waste site cleanup, but this is true across all of the MassDEP programs. In the Boston office, we have great news in that we have filled the emergency response coordinator position. Kathy Kiley is now our new ER coordinator. That's a position that's responsible for, our readiness, our emergency response coordinating with our ER coordinators in the regions, also working with the marine oil spill program. And Kathy brings a wealth of experience in that role, and we're really happy to have her. Kathy most recently worked in our technical and financial services division within waste site cleanup, where she dealt with things like the lab contracting, as well as NRD contract work. So with Kathy leaving, that is one of the positions that we will be filling and posting soon. Suela John has also moved into a Council 2 position in Office of General Counsel. And Suela has worked with the waste site cleanup program prior to this, but in her new role, she'll be dealing with issues like cost recovery, federal sites, and financial inability. You may have heard that Lisa Alexander retired back in October. So Lisa was our audit and enforcement coordinator for waste site cleanup. So we are in the process of hiring for that position, as well as we'll be posting a Brownfields coordinator position in the Boston office, and Diane Baxter will speak about that a little bit later on, because that is related to preparing for the federal funding that is coming our way. In the Central Regional Office, Kevin Doust, who many of you know as the former Emergency Response Coordinator, has a new role as the Section Chief for the Site Management and Compliance Assistance Section. The Section Chief, Mike LeBlanc, has just recently retired. Amy Sullivan is moving into the Site Management and as the Branch Chief. Phil Olson has joined the Emergency Response Program, replacing Timothy Mouse, who transferred to the Central Regional Office PFAS branch. Wes Perry, who formerly with the Northeast Office, has joined CIRO's audit program. And CIRO is now in the process of hiring Kevin Doust's replacement as the ER Section Chief. In the Western region, Chris Shaw is now working in the Site Management Risk Reduction group. And back in June, they had 2 people, Cynthia Pulowski and Kathy Chamberlain, retire, and they were both in that group. So Western region is also in the process of hiring for Caprice's position and others related to PFAS work. We have new staff in Nero in the emergency response group, Roya Nazari and Gregory Murray, and they just started at the beginning of this month. And Nero has lost a large number, I think Steve said 11 positions over the past year from the waste site cleanup group as a result of retirements and transfers. So they are likewise really, really busy in trying to fill those positions. And Southeast region is fortunately, at least in the last quarter, has not seen any retirements or changes in positions. But as you can kind of get a sense from this, and I will also apologize in case I missed anyone on this list. I was really just focused on what occurred in the last quarter. But I think it gives you a feel for how much activity we have in terms of people coming in, new people coming in, and the work we have to do around hiring. So let me just double check before I move on. So I think I'm going to stop now, actually, and I'll take any questions, and then I think Diane will be next in terms of talking about the federal program updates. So any questions from the advisory committee on anything I just covered? Anyone else?
A lot of changes going on.
Yeah, it is. It's a lot. It's a lot on top of, everything we're all experiencing, but challenging times in general. Yeah.
Yep.
All right, I'll share my screen if there's no other comments or questions for Liz. All right. Is that sharing?
It's sharing, but not yet in slideshow. There you go.
All right. Okay, so as Liz mentioned, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the Federal Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, also more commonly known as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, and just a little bit about what it means to waste site cleanup, and in particular to the federal sites group, federal grants group. So the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law was signed into law by President Biden in November. And among other things, it includes funding of $3.5 billion for Superfund site cleanup work and 1.5 billion for brownfields revitalization. So I'll go into each of these separately in the next few slides. So on the Superfund side, the funding is for a cleanup of NPL sites, and that also includes the assessment that will lead to cleanups. So that includes remedial investigations, feasibility studies, remedial designs, which also would include pre-design investigations, and then the remedial actions themselves. EPA's focus is on accelerating the work on these sites in order to advance the cleanup of fund lead sites in particular. So the sites that don't have a responsible party, basically the ones that EPA can control the funding and pace of the cleanup for. In recent years, EPA's funding for these sites has been dished out incrementally in small chunks, so it's really slowed the progress. And by this influx of funding, they hope to compress the schedules and get a lot more work done in a shorter time period. So DEP's role in this, just like on all Superfund sites, our role is to provide state review and oversight of the work performed, whether it be on fund lead sites that are done by EPA and their contractors, or by responsible parties and their contractors. We oversee all of that work. So the difference that we'll see, or we anticipate seeing because of the influx of funding, is that the pace of the work is going to change such that we'll have a lot more big active sites going on at once that'll require our attention. In addition, and this is a little bit more uncertain, we might see funding from the law come directly to us so that we can self-perform, and with the help of our contractors, some work. So not just overseeing, but also performing the work. This is likely to be pretty limited and mainly at sites where the state already has taken over long-term operation and maintenance, and maybe where an existing remedy needs to be revisited to ensure long-term protectiveness. So that's still uncertain, but it's a possibility. So to prepare for the influx of additional work and funding, we're hoping to hire additional staff. None of the positions for the Superfund site group are posted yet, but we're trying to work toward that. And this is just a list of the sites that we think are most likely to benefit from the influx of funding. The first one on the list isn't quite an NPL site yet, but we expect it to be listed in March, and work, hopefully we'll be able to get started on the investigations pretty quickly after that. The other sites here are a mix of sites in different phases of work. There are a few old ones that have been in remedial action, long-term O&M for a long time, and may need a little revisit. Other ones are in RIFS or remedial design and remedial action phase. In total, we have 31, including the new site, we have 31 Mass Superfund sites that we're monitoring. 13 of those are fund lead sites, and 18 are RP, responsible party lead sites. On the Brownfields side, of the 1.5 billion allocated to Brownfields, about 300 million is allocated to the state and tribal response program cooperative agreements. So these are, at least for DEP, is a grant funded under or authorized under CERCLA Section 128A. These grants are intended to build states' response systems, maintain states' response systems, as well as support brownfields. And in recent years, our grant has funded DEP staff. In the early years of the grant, there was enough funding to also do some site-specific work. But as the funding has dropped off over time, at some point several years ago, we got to a point that there wasn't enough in the grant that we could do site-specific projects. So one of the big things that we're hoping to come out of this infrastructure bill is for more money to become available for us to do site-specific projects under that 128A grant. The other main potential source of funding for brownfields that we hope to tap into is the $950 million in competitive grants. And these are ones that communities, states, tribes, and nonprofits can apply for. So multi-purpose grants, assessment grants, cleanup grants. We've gotten a couple of these grants in the past. One of them just expired about a year ago, where we had around $400,000 that we spent in Lawrence to help their brownfields on activities on several sites, several properties rather. So we hope to be able to tap into some of that funding as well. Over the years, especially since we haven't had a lot of money for cleanup projects, our main role has been coordination and collaboration with stakeholders, really to try to promote and advance brownfields redevelopment, cleanup assessment and redevelopment. So we serve as a resource to state and federal and a connection to state and federal stakeholders, as well as municipal community developers. We provide resources, training, you name it, to try to advance the program. So we hope to continue and do more of that with the influx of funding. And one of the ways, as Liz had mentioned earlier, is that we're planning to hire a statewide brownfields coordinator, a person who would work with internally in our own regions, but also be actively doing outreach to communities and helping obtain those competitive grants. So we're hoping that the posting for this position, it's any day now. It's been approved. It's just working its way toward posting on Mass Careers. So if you're interested in that kind of position, certainly keep your eye out. I hope it'll be posted this week, but if not, it seems likely to be early next week. And that's about all I have. Be happy to answer any questions that people have.
Yeah.
All right.
Diane, I have one question, just kind of a generic question about how Superfund and MassDEP MCP meshes. So as you may know, in our new amendments, we have climate change kind of resilient requirements, climate change adaptation vulnerability review requirements. It seems to me that Superfund sites, in terms of their remedies, are kind of ripe for needing to evaluate potential impacts of climate change, but I don't know what the federal requirements are. So how is that working, or do you not know at this point in terms of DEP's assistance to EPA on Superfund sites in consideration of potential climate change impacts on the remedy?
The CERCLA has well, the climate has been considered in CERCLA response actions. In my experience, mainly through evaluations in the feasibility study, at the feasibility study stage. There was an executive order some years ago that required consideration if you were anywhere near floodplain, wetlands and floodplains. But just more general, I think it's in the evaluation of short and long-term impacts. So that's one of the things that ends up being considered mainly when you're choosing the remedy. And what we try to do in general on any of these sites is to make sure that that what's being proposed is compliant with CERCLA, but also meets substantive requirements of our rules. So CERCLA cleanups don't have to comply with the letter of the MCP, all the submittals and whatnot. But the two programs are very similar in their overall goals. And we as we're reviewing, we make sure that they at least meet our kind of minimum standards.
Diane, I have a question. On the Superfund work for the NPL sites, and I'm thinking of the low end of Ponce River, how does the public stay informed of the work and assessment that's being planned and just planned cleanup activities?
There will be a community process, again, similar to the MCP. There's community involvement required at various steps. One of the first steps in planning typically is for EPA to prepare a community involvement plan. So they'll be doing that. They're already, during the listing process, there have been community meetings and there's been outreach to the municipalities as well, and that will continue. So keep an eye on EPA's website. In particular, there'll be a site set up for the Neponset site itself. So the notices will come out of EPA, but it'll happen.
Do abutters along the river get notified directly, or everybody has to watch the website?
I guess it depends on the type of work that's happening. I'm sure they'd be notified if there was going to be any work, right on their properties. But I'm not sure if there's investigation work on the river. Unless access is needed, I don't think that there would be notification to property owners, but I'm not 100% sure of that.
Thank you.
Certainly.
Any additional questions for Diane? Okay, thank you, Diane.
You're welcome.
And I think I'm going to go next to talk about PFAS. So I don't know if you need to stop sharing before I share, Diane.
Oh, I thought I stopped sharing. Okay. That's why it looked strange. Is it stopped?
Yep, I think that's good.
Okay.
Okay. And do you all see PFAS update?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. Next, I want to take a few minutes to just update you since the last time we did this kind of review as to where we are working on PFAS sites and some of the more recent results from both the public water supply testing and the private water supply testing. To start, I would mention that As you probably recall, that the PFAS legislative task force was meeting over last summer, taking testimony from a wide range of stakeholders on a number of different topics. And we're expecting that they'll have the final report from that work soon. So that's something to keep an eye out for. And that report will summarize what they heard as part of those hearings, as well as present their recommendations. So stay posted for that. Just having a tricky time. Oh, I see. Okay, here we go. Okay, so just to catch you up on where the department is with the testing that's going on with the public and private water supplies. And I'll remind you that there's a very nice story map on our website where you can look to see this information with a number of different tabs to get to the results. But to date, 974 public water supplies, that's community and non-community, have tested for PFAS out of the 1,466 that are required to test. So that's about 66% of those to date. Of the community water supplies, 442 out of the 450 have done the testing. And 94% of the population are drinking water that is meeting the PFAS 6 standard or better. In 90 cases, 90 public water supplies are currently, excuse me, are currently or were previously provided, were previously providing water to their customers that was in excess of the PFAS 6 MCL of 20 nanograms per liter. This is a screenshot of the story map where you can find this information. You will note that the numbers here in terms of the number of water supplies tested is a little different from what I just told you, because this hasn't yet been updated this month. I think I had, what did I say, 974. And you can also go to the EEA portal here and see the actual results under tab 3. If you search on PFAS as the contaminant of concern, you'll be able to see which water supplies have been impacted. In terms of the private well sampling program, you'll recall that that program is focused on 85 communities where 60%, greater than 60% of the residents are relying on private water supplies. To date, there have 3,898 homeowners have applied to be part of that program in those 85 towns. And 1,300 of them have sampled or are now in the process of sampling. So they've either sampled or test kits have been distributed to those homeowners. So that program is about a third of the way through those homeowners that have applied to be part of it. We have results now from 922 wells, and 94% of those are below the MCL. In terms of the wells that were tested as part of that program, there have been 5 that have exceeded our imminent hazard level of 90 nanograms per liter. And just to give you a sense of number of private wells and versus the number that are being tested as part of this program, there are about 200,000 private wells in Massachusetts. So I think that's about 2% of those wells are actually getting tested as part of this program. In terms of the results, you can see it, this pie chart just kind of breaking it down in terms of the concentrations detected. And you can see here the 94% that are meeting or below the PFAS 6 MCL. In terms of the work Waste Site Cleanup has been doing in response to these results and other work we've had been previously doing, investigating locations where of known PFAS releases. That's ongoing work. We've been very busy with all of that in the regional staff in particular. It involves following up on those IH conditions, providing POET systems in those cases, and bottled water in the interim, and then doing additional assessment around locations where we have detections to, in case there are any other exposures in private wells nearby. A lot of that work involves getting access to those properties to do the sampling. So that continues to be a very, very busy part of the program. And we expect, that to be a big focus in the year ahead as well. And I'll stop and see if anyone has questions.
Liz, is there any information about what types of sites are being found as potential sources of the PFAS in the private wells or the community wells? Or is it still kind of in its infancy?
I think it is still in its infancy. I mean, we have some that we know were related to, firefighting foam application. Others, it's still a question mark in terms of what was the source. So yeah, that's ongoing. I think our initial focus is focusing on the exposures and dealing with the private well owners and making sure that they are drinking water that is safe. But we are also, continuing as resources allow to do those kind of investigations into potential sources.
Yeah, I think there are really three categories as we go out. And as Liz said, a lot of our focus has been on, once we get the results in, working with the homeowners and taking whatever measures are necessary to make sure that they're drinking clean water. Beyond that, we're doing the kind of source identification work, and there's a little bit of backlog of that because of resources. And you could group it into kind of those sites where that it's obvious, and those typically are more the AFFF use, where the location is immediately adjacent to, say, a fire department. It's very likely that it's due to the AFFF use. There are others where it's just kind of out in the middle of nowhere and it's not clear yet. And then there are other cases where there are multiple possible sources that might be there, where you have kind of groups of potential sources that, because it might be more kind of industrial zoned, so you have several things there that additional work is going to be needed to actually identify which of specifically would be there.
Liz, I'm curious, outside of sites coming up from either private well testing or public water supply testing, how is PFAS kind of rolling out in general site evaluation through the rest of the program? Or are there sites coming in that way?
I don't know the number of additional sites that are coming in that way. I don't have a good sense of that, but I do know, for example, we have guidance out there in terms of whether it should be considered as a contaminant of concern. So I would imagine that that is being incorporated into site investigations that are going on. My sense is that hasn't led to a lot of more recent notifications or a large number, but I wouldn't be surprised if we do start to see that where people are incorporating PFAS testing into their general kind of site investigation work.
Sure.
Paul, do you think that's a?
Yeah, it does beg the question back to the advisory committee and the wider audience here, is kind of what has been your experiences so far, particularly working with your clients in identifying locations where, as in the course of your usual site assessment work, you realize that for either proximity to another location or because of the activities on the property itself, that PFAS might be a contaminant of concern, and kind of how often, how you're translating that into the site assessment phase of your work. Kind of what's your experience? Because that's where a lot of those sites are going to come from, where you're working on a site where, as you're considering what should be the contaminants of concern, what you should be sampling, what contaminants are likely to be there, you start looking for PFAS, and the private sector is going to start finding PFAS, and that's the way it should work. That's the way it worked. Certainly, one of our bigger 21E sites that came in because of site assessment, the airport at Martha's Vineyard, was a good example of how the system really should be working. So put it out there as a question to you guys. How often are you looking for PFAS, and how often are you finding it? Oh, I think something must be wrong with my audio.
Yeah.
I'm not hearing anything.
We're all muted. You've muted us all, Paul. I was speaking only for myself. I have not yet had a situation where I've had an obvious PFAS source. I have not had to deal with it. I can't imagine if there was one, particularly working for a buyer, that the buyer wouldn't want to know what was going on before he stepped into it.
I would agree that it's something that certainly buyers and lenders are asking for and looking for at sites now. But similar to Larry, I haven't encountered a site yet that we've been concerned about that being a contaminant of concern.
The only place it's come up is, and I'm actually representing the seller of an old salvage yard, and the buyer is interested in doing PFAS testing on that site. So that's my only experience where we've kind of discussed it.
Yeah, and I think coming at it from the 21E site assessment process, a lot of our sites are going to be in areas that are not GW1. So it might, given the reportable concentrations and the standards that would apply, it would be less of a problem. What we're doing with the private well and the public water supply sampling, by definition, those are in areas where drinking water is going to be a problem. So not surprisingly, when we find it, it becomes a major issue immediately.
But I mean,
actually, oh, sorry, go ahead, Eileen.
No, Kate, that's fine.
I was going to comment that the one situation that I've experienced where we've needed to test for PFAS in the groundwater has been where we needed a dewatering permit to discharge into an outstanding resource water. And so the endpoint was the drinking water source, but our site was not in a GW1 area. We did find basically what was a background condition of PFAS in the groundwater. There was no obvious source at our site or nearby, and needed to treat the dewatering effluent for PFAS because it's going into a water reservoir.
Yeah, we've had to.
Oh, sorry.
Oh no, I was going to point out that we've had to treat our remediation wastewater before discharge to a sewer system as well, as DEP doing remediation.
Yeah, what I was going to say is I'm working on a chlorinated site in an industrial area in upstate New York. And New York DEC is requiring soil and groundwater testing for PFAS. So kind of, I think philosophically a little bit different than how we're approaching it.
Yeah, where I'm seeing it tends to be more often in sites that have already been tested. And so I'm not getting a ton of it at the front end where buyers, and that's probably more a reflection of my practice, but I would expect that more and more buyers are going to want to see that PFAS testing on the front end before taking on a site. So I think I share that experience, but most of the sites that I'm seeing are where it's already been identified, sometimes in the diligence phase, sometimes because it's an ongoing MCP site. And we're having the same experience that Paul, you mentioned earlier in terms of source. Sometimes it's obvious. Sometimes it's not so obvious, potentially a combination of nearby industrial uses. And then other times it's just a mystery. And the mystery ones obviously are the most challenging, trying to figure out where that's coming from and how you fix it.
Yeah, I had the same experience as Eileen, our case manager on my site in Long Island, just said, yep, add PFAS to the water list. So no suspicion of PFAS, no reason for it, just New York is just asking all their sites to do that apparently to try to find out what's going on. And the only other site I've run into is I'm still fighting with my client to get them to test for PFAS, is where we have a gas station where there was a spill and the fire department responded, and the spill report indicates that the fire department applied foam in 1997. So I thought that was a reasonable PFAS site, but my client is still dithering.
I do think it's fair to say that, and maybe now since I'm in a different role, it's not my place to say that at some point, if it hasn't already, it's going to be one of the questions that auditors will be looking at and asking, as part of routine looking at sites. Should PFAS have been a contaminative concern given the site history there? So just something to think of. So Barry Fogel has asked in the chat, will the municipality be made a PRP where AFFF is the presumed source, whether the location is near a fire department property or a former firefighting location?
Well, I believe the answer to that is, with respect to fire training locations or as a matter of, AFFF storage at that location, that the fire department, we would look to them to be addressing that as a source of the PFAS contamination in those cases.
So I think one other thing about PFAS that happened since the last advisory committee meeting is you may be aware that EPA has submitted new toxicity information to their science advisory board last fall. and the draft reference doses that they're looking at are significantly more stringent than the current ones that are, the EPA's current values result in their guideline health advisory of 70 parts per trillion for drinking water. If the new toxicity values kind of hold up and go through the process, and that's a big if because there are a lot of steps along the way and everybody is looking at it, then the kind of equivalent drinking water levels based on those reference doses would be much lower than the 70 parts per trillion and even much lower than DEP's 20 parts per trillion. So I think it's something everybody should be keeping an eye on as you're doing the site assessments, as you're perhaps designing remedial systems, that it might not be sufficient to, you might, if you're planning a remedial system, for example, you don't necessarily aim for getting below the 20 parts per trillion, going as close to background as possible, to use one of our favorite terms, would be a good goal, because looking to the future, the target levels may be more stringent than they are now. Just a heads up, we'll all be following that to see kind of where it's all heading as EPA moves towards an MCL for PFAS.
Well, I just wanted to also point out that EPA issued an article last week on a super water critical treatment for PFAS. I don't know if you saw that.
Yeah.
The new technology that they're exploring and researching. I can send that article to you if you'd like.
Oh, yeah, that would be great. Yes, and everybody, if you run, there's so much going on with PFAS, and it's such a flood. If you do run across something interesting, something new, particularly treatment technologies or identification of sources, I think please forward it along to us, because there's a good chance we may have already seen it. We have a lot of people looking at various aspects of PFAS, but to make sure we're looking at everything to try to find a good, reasonable, workable way through this. So just assume that we're already seeing it. Better to forward it along.
Okay. So any more on PFAS before we move on? And thank you all for that. That was a really helpful discussion. So next, I'm going to turn things over to Michelle Craddock, and she's going to do highlights from Natural Resource Damages Program restoration projects last year. And I think this may be the first time that Michelle has been with this group. Michelle's been with us as our NRD coordinator since August 2020, I think. And she came to us from the Division of Ecological Restoration, and she already had a lot of experience with, both environmental restoration work as well as project management. So she has really just, she really just came in and really hit the ground running, and it's been great to have her here. So I'll turn it over to you, Michelle.
Great, thanks so much, Liz. Bear with me for a moment while I share my screen. All right, does that look right?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, thanks so much for joining me today to hear a little bit about some highlights from 2021 for the Natural Resource Damage Assessment and Restoration Program. So I'll give a very brief kind of background information on the program, just for those that aren't familiar with it or haven't heard from us in a while. So the NRD is kind of a process to determine whether public natural resources have been injured, destroyed, or lost due to the release of a hazardous substance or oil, and then to identify actions and funds needed to restore those resources. And so really the overarching goal is to restore impacted natural resources and the services that were lost while those natural resources were impaired or while they were being remediated. And so for this presentation, I'm just going to give some kind of highlights on restoration projects we've done this year, as well as highlight some of the settlements that we've had this year, and then talk briefly about some kind of goals for 2022 and moving forward. So federal, state, and tribal governments are authorized to act on behalf of the public as trustees of natural resources. And natural resources include, exactly what you'd expect. So things like land, fish, wildlife, biota, groundwater, drinking water resources, as well as the uses of those natural resources. So things like fishing, shell fishing, swimming, hiking. And so frequently those resources or the management of those resources is shared across various agencies. And in that case, we can act as co-trustees for a natural resource damages claim. And for the Commonwealth, we're typically working with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, as well as the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration on a majority of our cases. But we also work with other federal agencies as well as tribes when it's applicable. And so the Secretary of the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs is the Commonwealth's Natural Resource Trustee. However, the NRD program was delegated to MassDEP many years ago. And so MassDEP and staff in the Bureau of Wayside Cleanup do the typical day-to-day work, but the trustee kind of maintains oversight and approval of any kind of major steps in an NRD case. So approval to pursue a claim, approval to settle, as well as various approvals throughout the restoration process. And so, the below schematic just kind of gives a high level overview of what the NRD process looks like. It's, a little bit formulaic and is kind of laid out in the regulations, but it typically starts with a pre-assessment to make sure we have sufficient data to pursue a claim, as well as to kind of make sure that we have sufficient confidence that we would have a successful NRD claim before we start this process. We then move into the assessment phase, where we kind of determine and quantify injury to applicable natural resources, as well as determine a damages amount. We then move into the settlement phase. And then once we have settled and any associated damages funds are deposited in the NRD trust account, we move into the restoration phase. And so the restoration of the resources typically involves a lot of public input. We work with a lot of different partners on this. A big part of that is developing a restoration plan for the site, which evaluates a variety of different restoration alternatives for the resource. Once we've done all that, we begin to implement the restoration projects, and there's typically ongoing stewardship and monitoring to make sure that they are successful and that they are sufficiently restoring those injured natural resources. So some of you may have seen this kind of table before, but since 1992, when the Commonwealth started their NRD program, the Commonwealth settled over 20 NRD claims worth over $70 million. As you can see from these tables, the amount of damages we settle for varies a lot. Obviously, kind of New Bedford Harbor, the Bouchard B120 spill, and GE Housatonic are some of the larger settlements we've had, but we've also had a fair amount of smaller settlements that you can see on the right side of the screen. And then on the next slide, a few of these were settlements happened in 2021, so I'm going to talk a little bit more about them. Two of the settlements we had this year were both state-only settlements. First one I'm going to talk about is an acid spill that happened in Coleraine, Massachusetts in 2019. In this case, there was, somewhere between 53 and 60 gallons of concentrated sulfuric acid released into the North River in Coleraine. And this resulted in the death of more than 270,000 fish. And it also damaged wetland resource areas and designated habitat for two listed, state-listed rare species. So that was a fish and a dragonfly. And so clearly this was a very high quality habitat that was injured here. And so the NRD program worked with the Attorney General's office, as well as the Massachusetts Division of Fisheries and Wildlife, and various other programs within MassDEP, aside from just the NRD program, on this settlement. The settlement ended up being about $1.5 million, of which $225,000 went into the Commonwealth's NRD Trust to be used towards restoration of those injured resources. The second settlement I wanted to talk about was a fuel spill into Rumney Marsh that happened in 2020. And so in that case, there was 10,000 gallons of gasoline and 1,000 gallons of diesel that were released into Rumney Marsh in Revere via stormwater system. In that case, a fuel truck rolled over in a rotary, and all the fuel entered the stormwater system and then entered into Rumney Marsh. And for anyone familiar with Rumney Marsh, it is a state designated area of critical environmental concern. And so that was, definitely an area we're interested in protecting. And when there are impacts to it, that we typically would pursue an NRD claim there. And so this one was part of a DEP enforcement case, or was done in collaboration with an NRD or a DEP enforcement case, and was handled administratively by MassDEP. And we collected just over $52,000 in NRD settlement funds there. And then additionally, there were other kind of fines by MassDEP that were part of that settlement. And so the next steps for these cases are that in the future, MassDEP will be issuing kind of competitive grant solicitations for restoration projects that would directly benefit the areas that were impacted, as well as the resources that were impacted. So we hope to do that, sometime in the next year or so. And I'm going to move into some highlights, restoration highlights over the past year. So this is the part where we talk about, the pretty pictures, the happy ending stories to these kind of environmental disasters. And so the first one I'm going to talk about are some restoration projects associated with the Bouchard B120 oil spill, which happened way back in 2003, but we are still actively working on restoration projects associated with that settlement. So there, for those unfamiliar, there was 98,000 gallons of oil spilled into the coastal waters of Massachusetts and Rhode Island. It impacted hundreds of miles of shoreline, degraded salt marshes, mudflats, beaches. A number of bird species were killed and or injured, including piping plovers, terns, and loons. And it also impacted, the ability of people to go shell fishing, as well as beach access. And so those were all the restorations attempted to address all of those injuries. And so, like I said, we've been working on a variety of restoration projects over the years, but two of the more timely ones that have had a lot of active work over the past year are ones that include loon restoration and translocation, as well as the purchase of land and protection of land on Cuddyhunk Island. So, like I said, many loons were killed as a result of the spill, and so a portion of the settlement funds were directed towards loon restoration. And so we've really focused on that in the past year. So one of the projects we've been working on with a consultant called the Biodiversity Research Institute is to translocate loons from Maine down to Massachusetts in an attempt to expand their range in Massachusetts. And so loons historically were, located and breeding across the state, but the area where they're actively located now has shrunk a bit just due to, impacts from human use and disturbance. And so we're trying to expand the population to what it used to be. And so one of the techniques we've been using is the translocation of loons with the thinking that, if a loon fledges from the area, it will return there to breed. And so by translocating young loons here, we've seen that they do return back to these lakes, to these resources to breed. And so we've seen that successfully in 2020 and 2021 with loons returning back here. This work has been mainly focused on southeastern Massachusetts. And in the coming year in 2022 and 2023, we're going to focus on expanding the population out in the Berkshires. So we're preparing now for what that's going to look like over the next year and what lakes we're going to be using. And so the pictures you can kind of see on the top left, those are the loon pens that are out on a pond in southeastern Massachusetts. That's kind of when they take the loons, they put them in there and they raise them until they get large enough to live on their own in the lakes. And then we've also issued over $4 million in grants for loon restoration projects across New England and New York over the past year. And those projects will benefit loons by, through land preservation, through different kind of management techniques like lead tackle buybacks, all in an attempt to benefit the loon population throughout New England and restore the population that was injured as a result of that oil spill. And so the other project I wanted to highlight, it was a really big project being led by the Buzzards Bay Coalition. And that is, they have been working on purchasing and protecting over 300 acres of land on Cuddyhunk Island. And the trustees committed significant funds towards this purchase, along with many other state agencies that contributed to make this project possible. And so now there's, you can kind of see in the highlighted areas, there's a huge swath of this island has been protected. It's obviously very valuable habitat, really valuable habitat for migratory birds. And the trustees were really excited to be part of that and have that as part of their restoration plan. Two other projects to highlight also associated with Bouchard. It was a busy year for Bouchard restoration, is the Horseshoe Mill Pond Dam removal in Wareham, as well as installation of some conservation boat moorings to benefit eelgrass in West Falmouth Harbor. And both these projects were funded by the trustees, but they were led by the Buzzards Bay Coalition, who's one of our really great partners in that area. And so the dam removal opened up 3 miles of river habitat to migratory fish like river herring. Also provided great recreational opportunities and climate change resiliency benefits. That project was completed in very early 2021, but we were able to get out on site for a ribbon cutting ceremony earlier in the fall of 2021 to celebrate everyone's accomplishments and celebrate the project's success. So it looks really great. So anyone from, that lives in that part of the state should go check it out. There's some great trails. And the transformation is amazing. You can see in the pictures the kind of before of the dam and the after of the free flowing river is really, really impressive to see in person. Additionally, the trustees funded Buzzards Bay Coalition to install conservation boat moorings in West Falmouth Harbor. Eelgrass was one of the things that was impacted by the spill. And so these conservation boat moorings are replacing traditional boat moorings. And so they don't move around.
Michelle?
Sorry, I was waving my hands and dragged my headphones
Oh,
right out
okay.
of my.
You just
My
lost your
headphones out.
audio.
Sorry about that. And so these conservation boat moorings are replacing traditional boat moorings in an attempt to protect the eelgrass and let it repopulate areas where it has been kind of dug up before due to these boat moorings kind of moving around and scarring the ocean floor. And so in 2021, they were able to install 41 new moorings. That's shown by the red dots on the map. That was replacing traditional ones. The blue dots are ones that had already been replaced, and then the kind of yellow tan dots show the remaining ones that are still conventional boat moorings. And so these will have ongoing monitoring for the next 5 years just to see how successful they are and whether the eelgrass is able to kind of restore and repopulate those areas that were injured. Finally, moving to the western part of the state, another case we've been working on for a long time is associated with the GE Housatonic River NRD case. Here we're kind of nearing the end of our restoration. We've done many rounds of restoration. This is round 4, the final round. And in the past year, we've had 4 kind of ongoing grants out. One focused on watershed education programs in the Housatonic River area, along with MassDEP, who's done a great job doing outreach and school events despite all the challenges from COVID, obviously. We've also been working with the Housatonic Valley Association to upgrade a culvert, as well as with them on a project to kind of plan and prioritize road stream crossings, culverts, that will be more flood resilient and fish friendly. And so they have a great project that's going on over the past year to do that. And we're also working with Mass Division of Fisheries and Wildlife on a calcareous fen restoration, which is going to restore about 1,300 acres of that kind of significant wetland habitat in the Housatonic River watershed. And those are all kind of, ongoing, but, had significant work in 2021. Going on. And then finally, the last one I wanted to highlight was some restoration projects associated with the Blackburn and Union Privileges Superfund site NRD settlement. And so the trustees have funded several projects here to restore Trap Hole Brook and Trap Hole Brook watershed. Trap Hole Brook's a significant ecological resource. It's a cold water fishery resource. It's also home to one of the densest populations of brook trout in eastern Massachusetts. So it's a really special place. And so our restoration plan really focused on helping to restore the resources there. And so over the past year, we funded work to advance the replacement of 2 undersized culverts in the watershed, one in Sharon and one in Walpole, as you can see on the screen. As well, in 2021, kind of the focal point of our restoration plan is the removal of the Trap Hole Brook Dam, which is in Norwood. And we were able to, using trustee funds as well as funds from the Municipal Vulnerability Program, we were able to secure sufficient funds to remove the dam, and that is actually starting right now. We expect the dam to start to come out in early February, so just in another week or 2. So that's another really exciting project. Again, this is not just the trustees. These are projects with lots and lots of partners that are pushing them along, including Neponset River Watershed Association, the municipalities, as well as the Division of Ecological Restoration. So again, anyone local to that area, it'll be an exciting project to kind of see move forward. And those are all the highlights I wanted to provide. Before I open up for any questions, though, I want to just give a couple thoughts on our priorities for 2022. We have a lot of cases in assessment and settlement negotiations right now, so we hope to have several of those to highlight in the future. If we do have those, I'm sure there'll be press releases issued. So hopefully I'll have a chance to talk about that in the future. We also have a lot of restoration projects starting in 2022, kind of as I mentioned with the dam removal, as well as many projects, restoration projects that'll be kicking off as part of the Industrialplex NRD settlement that we had a couple of years ago. And then finally, we are actively working on the NRD standard method regulations. We really hope to have a public hearing draft out at some point in the first half of this year. So that's a high priority for us, and we're actively working on it. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions anyone has. And also my contact info is up there, so anyone feel free to, contact me at any time.
Michelle, we were the recipient of an NRDA grant in the town of Arlington. That was the JP Noonan for
Yep.
about $50,000. Similar actually to looking at it to the Revere oil spill in a rotary, which is actually a more common problem for trucks that are about 10,000 gallons of fuel oil, running around all delivering oil to us, overturning in rotaries near wetlands. It's more common than we think. And so I'm very supportive of a public hearing and getting out the standard method so that these NRD settlements can move along a little more quickly, and the communities and the environment that's affected by these spills can get restored in a more timely fashion. So I support that. I do have one question for you. One of the obstacles we found in doing our restoration was actually getting a memorandum of agreement with, in this case, it was DCR, but of course, there's always lots of different agencies that are involved in a project. And we were fortunate to be able to bring all these agencies to the table and get the project done. But then that last little piece of how do we do maintenance over time, because it wasn't the property of the town of Arlington, was a hurdle. So what can you do, or is that something on your radar screen to help with these smaller, the larger NRDs, of course, they have a lot of support and people that can go towards this. The smaller ones that are run by the towns and municipalities don't have a lot of support to put forth to help get these last pieces done. But is that something that's on your radar screen to help with?
Yeah, I think it's definitely on my radar screen. And I think, you're not the first one to bring that issue up. So I think it's something we're thinking about. Obviously, municipalities are they're really, taxed. They have a lot of priorities, a lot of things going on. And so an NRD grant might just be one little part of it. And so I think we're cognizant of that. And where we can, we try, the NRD program tries to help where we can, or bring in, other experts to assist with these projects, whether it's, helping a town or municipality develop like an RFP, review proposals, provide, technical input on stuff, and maybe it's, trying to, assist with, MOAs or MOUs with other state agencies. I think we certainly try to help where we can and kind of learn over time, what works and what doesn't. So I think it's a good question. I think it's something we're working on, in the future. And I'll just add that, you mentioned in the beginning about, the rotaries and these kind of, the one in Arlington and then this one on Rumney Marsh. And so I just point out that both those cases, we did use that kind of standard method that we have in development. It's not in regulation, but we have been testing it out on those cases, and it has made kind of the NRD process go a lot quicker than it would have had it in the past. Or, you know, those might not have been claims we would have pursued if we didn't have this kind of model and method in development. So I think that's interesting to note.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Michelle? Okay, great. Thanks, Michelle. So I think next and last we have Paul Locke is going to talk about last month's soil capacity, disposal capacity listening session and what we heard at that session, and some thoughts about next steps.
Okay, I hate following Michelle because she gets to do all these fun things, and I can highly recommend going to the ribbon cutting for things like dam removals. I was at that last one in the fall. It's a lot more fun than soil disposal capacity listening sessions, which I think for all of you who may have attended was a bit of a downer. So here I come following Michelle, bringing a summary of that meeting and discussions about kind of where we're going to go next. So let me share the screen. So it was December 16th. We had a good turnout. 20 people or so had let us know that they wanted to provide some testimony. It was mostly a listening session for us to get a good sense of than we already had of what the problems people were facing and what the magnitude of the problems are, and to hear people begin talking about some proposed potential solutions. All of this is online, the video from the meeting, and we just posted the transcript. So if you'd rather read than sit through the video, you can do that as well. And the URL is at the bottom of the screen there. Oh, get over there. Okay, so we tried to break this up into kind of a summary of the problem statements that we heard, and these are all probably very familiar to you all, but it was good having them listed and emphasized and re-emphasized and re-emphasized. The lack of capacity, the lack of facilities, particularly in-state in Massachusetts. People talked about the facilities that are there and their expected lifetime growing very short as facilities close down one by one. The lack of capacity, lack of facilities specifically for things beyond soil, that it's not just a soil management issue. There are a number of materials competing for the same limited capacity airspace, whether it's dredge spoils, C&D residuals, recycling residuals, asbestos waste, biosolids, mud materials. A lot of different stuff is competing for the same limited space, and the space is just going away, I would say slowly but surely, but it's not even that slowly. At this point, I'll put in a plug for EBC's Construction Demolition Material Management Summit that's happening tomorrow. If you're really interested in all of these and how it all relates. And one of the benefits, I think, of where I am in my new capacity is this list of other materials, whether it's coming from the solid waste world, our Bureau of Air and Waste, or whether it's coming from things like biosolids, which is our Water Bureau, Bureau of Water Resources. I find myself in meetings day after day where the issue of capacity and the cost of dealing with these materials comes up over and over again. So we're looking both with capacity that's in Massachusetts. We got a lot of information about diminishing capacity in other northeastern states. You're all aware that other landfills have been closing earlier and earlier in the year as they reach the annual capacity. And there are new fees that are being developed for out-of-state materials. Some landfills are giving preference to the local communities, which is completely understandable, but it's pushing the available options for disposal of material from Massachusetts further and further away from the state. And there are a number of environmental justice issues associated with this, particularly in that it's slowing down the pace of site redevelopment and cleanup, potentially allowing ongoing exposures to these materials because it becomes less cost effective to actually conduct the remediation. There are specific issues related to TCLP soils, lead, specific to asbestos, specific to petroleum, the diminishing number of recycling sites that are out there. People brought up the Brownfields tax credit applicability to soil management. The people emphasized kind of what this means on a ground level of the number of trucks per day. The further you go, the fewer trucks that you can actually have. You don't get 2 trips a day out of a truck. You might get 1 trip a day, and in some cases, as you go further, you may get 1 trip every couple of days. So all of which adds to the cost. And all of this with the prospect of having to manage PFAS contaminated soil more and more on the horizon, with issues specific to PFAS and capacity is just going to add on to things. All in all, it was a very sobering discussion of what the issues are and the effects that this lack of capacity has had, whether it's that people are facing increased costs because of new fees and simply because of supply and demand. If there's limited capacity, that capacity is going to cost more and more. Projects are going to be turned away. And when soil from projects are turned away and you can't find an outlet for it, that means that jobs, redevelopment projects are going to just flat out stop and have stopped temporarily and for a longer term. Communities find that they can't get rid of things that they typically need to, catch basins, sediments, residuals, wastewater scum. The number of trucks per day and the capacity goes down, spreading out the timing of these. And the delays that are occurring, whether you have to stop excavation for some period of time until capacity opens up, or pushing projects into the next year when the landfills reopen again. And then there's a huge rush for people to bring the soil that have been stockpiled to that, which is just going to end up resulting in the landfills either having to close down earlier in the season because people are rushing to fill that capacity really early, or also that there may be shorter term limits on what the landfills can take in, monthly limits in addition to the annual limits. As we're looking at it, there's more and more transport to either the Midwestern states or Canada, and just trucking this stuff that far away is increasing the carbon emissions at a time when the state is actively trying to minimize and eliminate those carbon emissions. And there's a point in there that I forgot to mention on one option is shipping this by train, but there are limited capacity for that as well. So the fun part of this is looking at the suggestions for what can be done about it in the short, in the long term. So I would caveat these next couple slides in that these are the suggestions that we've heard. So these came from you, the regulated community, and these are not things that DEP is pushing or saying that, oh yeah, this is where we're going to focus. It's a laundry list of what we heard. Certainly for things that the private sector can do, we heard people suggesting that LSPs and the developers should modify their plans and try to minimize the amount of excavation that's happening and the volume going off-site, which is great, but there are limits to how much you can do that. Treating materials on-site, including in situ stabilization, being able to leave more in place and kind of work that out through the MCP process. Minimize the amount that has to be disposed of by screening out things that can be reused or shipped elsewhere, cobbles, boulders, etc. Propose more Subtitle D landfills in Massachusetts. That's on you guys. Find some projects and propose them. People pointed out it would be helpful to have rail transfer stations near Boston, which again, these are things that the private sector can help develop proposals and come to DEP for approval. People are entering into contracts with landfills to lock in capacity, which is great if you're able to do that, but it benefits the bigger players, and in the end, it's locking out smaller generators and smaller projects that then don't have access to that, further increasing their costs. Finding ways to reuse material and again, treating things and either treating on site or treating it off site and bringing it back to the site and reusing there. Also interesting is what you thought we could do. Changing COM 15 to allow less than RCS2 remediation waste, and this would be material coming from RCS1 locations, greater than RCS1, less than RCS2, it by definition becomes remediation waste, and thus it's prohibited to go to COM 15. We could change COM 15 to allow those wastes to go to the facilities. Modifying COM 97 to allow higher concentration, taking pressure off Subtitle D facilities was suggested. Allow COM 97 soils to be used at other 21E sites. And people suggested using an ACO approach similar to what we did with COM 15 to do this. And this was suggested in context of vulnerability to climate change and addressing sea level rise, raising the elevations. This kind of soil could be a benefit to use in order to raise facilities and raise locations. Allow more reuse of treated soils at landfills rather than disposal. Great. Relax landfill expansion regulations and permit more Subtitle D landfills in Massachusetts. Both of those, well, the regulations, and this is particularly, I think, involve the siting requirements. A lot of that is statutory rather than regulatory on how landfills get sited. And I think we would be more than willing to consider and permit more Subtitle D landfills in Massachusetts if people were to propose them. I think that gets back to the suggestion to relax regulations. Expanding the market for post-processed materials and simplifying recycling, the whole regulatory environment and how the solid waste program interacts with the 21E program and interacts and overlaps with the hazardous waste program. In addition, there are working within the solid waste master plan on ways to deal with ash and sludges and soil. Like I said, it's not just simply soil. There are other materials as well. permitting more rail sidings. If people come to us with proposals, we can look at that and do that. DEP could provide brownfields tax credits for landfill capping projects that are upside down financially. Just to be clear, DEP cannot do that. Tax credits come out of DOER, but it's a thing we'll keep on the table. Look at the way Connecticut allows storage and reuse of contaminated soil being staged at other locations and then translated out. Using contaminated soil across projects as well as within a project. We heard some interesting examples from the MBTA about where reuse of soils within MBTA projects has been very effective, and their frustrations in not being able to use soil across projects from one MBTA project to another. Expanding kind of the use of contaminated soil in rail lines beyond the active right-of-way to include under buildings and parking lots, that sort of thing. And many of these people suggested using a COM15-like ACO process might be a way to allow this to happen in a way that's managed appropriately with an appropriate amount of oversight. So that's kind of a very quick summary of what we heard. And not surprisingly, there are no silver bullets in any of that. But what we took to heart is kind of how significant the issue is, and not just for the wayside cleanup program, but the solid waste program and other DEP programs, and some kind of coordinated cross-program effort is going to be needed. So as far as next steps, the kind of recognizing that it is a cross-program issue, our next step is we're convening a meeting within DEP with the other programs, solid waste programs, people from the Bureau of Water Resources, and with our regional staff to talk through some of the proposals and try to split them into things that we can do today by policy that is appropriate to do and that we have the ability to relatively quickly do. And there are other things that might require regulatory changes and things that might require statutory changes. So breaking it up to try to bite off pieces that can work. We're interested in talking with our sister agencies like the MBTA, Department of Transportation, DCR, on how this affects state sites and state projects as well. And then coming back to the broader community to talk about some of specific actions that can be taken. So the internal meeting should be happening in the next few weeks, and probably looking to February to schedule an outside meeting. You want to go back and talk about dam removals?
So I'm glad you're doing that internally, since you are in a position to maybe get some stuff done internally. I think that will be productive, and I hope you can do something when you do the interagency discussions too. I mean, wayside cleanup has been a lot easier to deal with than almost any other agency in terms of making progress. So I would hate to see things get slowed down by other agencies that you're trying to coordinate with.
Yeah, I think the other agencies, like say MBTA, they have interests similar to yours in this. I differentiate between working with other regulatory programs has certain challenges where we're all operating under different statutes and different regulations. So as try as we do to try to be as consistent as possible, we recognize there is a challenge because we have we're all working under different laws with different authorities. Even within DEP, we have to work out and coordinate and find out what's possible given the legal framework that we're dealt, and which is further beyond our control than regulations we can change. Policies we can change quickly, regulations take longer, but if there's a statutory roadblock, then that's a different level of effort, which is good to identify and begin talking about. So if we go down that route, we're laying the groundwork for that. Working with the other state agencies often is very similar to working with the private sector, in that other agencies are often there at the table as a PRP, as a group that has to manage and pay for the remedial efforts. Often it's not their primary role in life. If your job is to construct the Green Line extension, you're doing that through contaminated soil. Your primary job is the Green Line extension, and they're trying to find a safe, appropriate way of managing that contaminated soil, but doing it in a way that disrupts their primary goal of building their rail line as little as possible. So we understand that. But they also have, because of that, they have some good insights and are dealing with soil on a very large scale.
Well, if we think about some of the solutions that were suggested, on the topic of being able to take, say COM97 soils, which is remediation waste, and, conduct background evaluations or anti-degradation evaluations and propose their reuse at other disposal sites. I think that is primarily under the control of the MCP. And I'm curious on your thoughts on the feasibility of that solution.
Well, it's certainly something that, coming out of that meeting is one of the potential answers, at least at some level. As we do, I mean, the existing prohibitions and desire to manage soil on site, and if you have to move it off site, move it to someplace to be reused or disposed appropriately. I think that could still be consistent with those overall goals. What we do want to make sure, we don't want to set up a system where some locations become de facto contaminated soil landfills. And so as we talk about the potential for reusing contaminated soil at other locations, at other sites, we want to do so in a way that where it's legitimate reuse and not simply creating a big pile of contaminated soil.
So Paul, is a follow-up to Kate's comment, also confined within the regulations, is just a PRP being allowed to move remediation waste from, one site to another site, that they own, even the simplest situation where it's one project that has multiple different RTNs on it, and the prohibition of, moving soil from one MCP site to another MCP site. And that seems like really low hanging fruit that can be addressed, pretty simply within the MCP, and doesn't even get into some of the other concerns that you just raised about, kind of transport of soil from one location to another.
How does it avoid that?
Well, it avoids it if this is part of one larger project and it's, adjacent property,
Yeah.
you know, it's very different than, you know, taking soil across town to a different piece of property.
Right. So, and so I think that's part of where we certainly have to look at it and how we manage and what kind of parameters you build into that and the case that you're describing where it might be a parcel immediately adjacent, and you know, that might be different, and we might be able to deal with that in a different way than a site that's across town.
Right.
And we definitely don't want to set up a system where and let's just say the state owns a lot of property. We wouldn't want the MBTA collecting all of their, and I'm not picking on the MBTA, please be clear. Taking all their contaminated soil and moving it to one location in, say, Somerville, and just having a big pile of contaminated soil there. I think there are ways that we can look at it and evaluate the reuse. And I think that's probably why people had suggested things like ACOs as a way to manage and control that, as having some level of DEP review and approval, so that the rules are clear to people, and we're not creating new problems by creating de facto soil landfills, and I think that's certainly an issue that we would want to look at through the lens of environmental justice, because frankly, when you have situations where people are bringing contaminated soil, it's unlikely to end up in nice pristine areas, lovely settings. They typically would go to, and I'm generalizing, and it may be completely inappropriate, but in areas that is already contaminated, the neighborhoods and areas might already be under environmental stress, and in general, if you're going to create a big soil pile, it's not going to be on property that has high value and is slated to be reused for something else. So we certainly want to make sure that if the soil is being reused, it's being appropriately reused. It's not just creating disposal locations elsewhere, getting around somehow circumventing the kind of landfill and disposal regulations.
And I appreciate that, and that's really important. But when you think about it, it also needs to be scalable.
Yep.
And as I'm saying, because the other extreme of that is, a large project with multiple disposal sites on it, and you can't move soil within the project. And trying to get DEP approval to do something like that is just like, it's just not worth it. So I'm saying it needs to be scalable so that you can really run the gamut. And do the type of protection that you're talking about, but also, kind of facilitate the common sense project and then everything in between.
Yeah, and I think there are ways of doing that, and those will be interesting discussions to have as we get into detail of kind of what are the situations we'd like to encourage that, how would you define them, what kind of rules would you put around it, and how that would work. Carol Boyce just noted that ACOs are a clunky way to do it, and you're right. ACOs require from a kind of DEP resource perspective, which is one way that we look at this, a lot of time and effort to put into creating them and then kind of managing them, keeping an eye on them, whereas self-implementing regulations like a lot of the MCP is a more streamlined approach. So it's a question of kind of what would we like to achieve, how you define it, what kind of limits and parameters you put around that, and what's the best kind of regulatory approach to make sure that it works consistently and effectively. So I think there are some things that are well within our kind of ability to do. All of this, to some degree, is nibbling around the edges. Certainly, examples that Eileen was describing on an individual project, if you have a large project with multiple sites around it and you get and if we're able to give the flexibility to move soil around there and reuse it on that, that's great for that project. But that's just one piece of the larger issue. There are a lot of projects out there where there isn't space in the redevelopment to reuse the soil. And because of the design of the project, soil is going to have to be removed, whether it's contaminated, not contaminated, slightly contaminated, or highly contaminated. And you have to find outlets for that. So there are, I think we recognize that there have to be a number of things that are happening to nibble a little here, nibble a little there, give some relief where we can, find some flexibility where we can, and kind of minimize the out-of-state, long-distance disposal that we're facing right now. But if anybody still has the silver bullet left, let us know. But we're certainly willing to take on, a lot of different bits and try to do what we can in the short term and then in the longer term.
When Wendy Rundle commented in the chat that the LSPA supports the nibbling approach.
I would like to take a couple big bites, but. So somebody suggested Ontario as an option. We're look at the way other agencies, other states, other provinces are doing it. We're really willing to take it into account and look at other options for this.
Hello.
Background definitions should be revised. Yeah, maybe not. Yeah. So Carol also suggests that the background definition should be revised. I would point out that years ago, as we were developing the background and definition and anthropogenic background and natural background and historic fill, it was clear that those were definitions that would be revised over and over again and tweaked as time went on. They're constantly under revision. So, but we also don't want to be in a situation where we're just revising the definition in order to allow more contamination to be spread around. All of this has to be in the context of we want to minimize the potential for exposure to contaminated soil and the risk associated with that. Our goal is not to spread it around and find outlets and allow people to be exposed to it. We want to make sure whatever we do that there are enough controls and limits so that we're not creating new problems. And I know Carol is not proposing that we create new problems, but there are a lot of different links and implications to all of this.
I love new problems, Paul.
Yeah. And yet this is such an old problem.
I just wanted to point out, I said you should revisit the background concentrations, not revise them.
Oh, okay.
In other words, we've got a lot of data now on background conditions. I think every LSP here has a lot of background conditions, on a lot of different places and not entirely applicable, but there's a lot of new data out there. So that's, I was just stating that I understand the difficulty. You're trying to balance toxicity, locations, but this whole concept that we've always struggled with of shifting Massachusetts the top 15 feet out to other states is kind of ludicrous if we can't find a place for it.
Yeah.
Paul, you mentioned next as being internal meetings among various departments in the state. what do you foresee as other opportunities for, public input on this topic or public up?
Well, I think we'll be coming back hopefully in February to have the next kind of broader meeting like we did in December, and come back and refine that. The list that I went through is what we heard. I think we can and want to work internally to figure out, okay, what can we do now, and start working with the stakeholders on those specific things. So February, hopefully.
We could potentially aim for doing that, the same date that we'd otherwise hold the office hours. Want to think about that, Paul?
Yeah, and I was asked, do we have the solid waste folks involved in these? Yes, and at the December meeting, Greg Cooper, who's the division director that includes the solid waste program, attended. Was sitting in on those, as well as some of his staff. So they are actively involved. Okay, well, that's it for me.
Well, I think that's it for all of us. We're hoping to wrap up by 11, and that's where we are right now. So hearing no objections, I just want to thank everyone for participating today. And I think our next Wayside Cleanup Advisory Committee quarterly meeting will be in March. So hope to see you then, if not sooner, at the next soil discussion. So thanks very much. And I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, Liz and Paul.
Okay.
Thanks, everybody. Be safe.
Take care.